As I cannot, oh man, I cannot tell you guys how excited I am for this show today. I was reading through Jeremy's book. Okay, if you don't know who Jeremy is, I'm going to let him introduce himself in just a minute. He's a lawyer, but he was Mormon for the majority of his life and became, uh, through this crazy story, is now Catholic. It's one of the most compelling stories. Like okay, I've read a lot of books in apologetics. Okay, I've read a lot, and this is one of the only books in apologetics, which I would categorize that is it's like it's loosely, I would say
Sure.
a good chunk of it is apologetics, right?
Yeah.
Um, but it's a page turner. Like I could not stop reading it. I mean, I put a good chunk of time today to reading this, and I've had to like stop and do other things while I was going throughout my day and stuff. But I could not stop reading it. It was that compelling, and I don't think I've had that experience with another book in apologetics. Your conversion story, we're going to get into that all the details, as much as details we can tonight in an interview. For the full story, you guys need to go buy the book. Remind me the name of the book, and I'll tell the audience while you're mentioning that. I've got it linked in the description if you guys want to go purchase it.
Yeah. The book is called From the Susquehanna to the Tiber, let me get the subtitle, a memoir of conversion from Mormonism to the Roman Catholic Church.
It is one of the best books I've read on again in apologetics. And I'm not just saying that to like pump up this book and to get. I don't get any kickback from sales on a book like this or anything like that. No, actually, to correct that, I think this is actually like a an Amazon link. So if it's an affiliate link, so I guess there is some kickback, but that's not why I'm saying this. Like it really is that good. Let's get into some of the details though. First, I learned. I think you opened your book with your age. You are 2 months older than me. We are
Oh,
that close in
really?
age. Yeah, you
I
were
didn't
born
know
in
that.
January of '87. Is that right?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. And what's going to confuse people, actually, we should have talked about this too, is that on the thumbnail of this video, I've got like an older picture of you without the mustache, and now
Yeah.
you've got like this glorious handlebar mustache. Uh,
Yeah.
what's going on?
I ditched the cleaner look and went for the mustache. My hair's a little bit longer too. But
You just need like a cowboy hat or something.
Yeah, yeah, I should have worn a Stetson or something.
Mm.
But I was just by way of introduction to your audience. I was born in a very rural community in southeastern Utah to very devout Mormon parents. They had 7 children. I'm the second to youngest in the family, and grew up in Utah. Um, a very devout family in the Mormon Church. Went, we'll get into sort of the details uh, later on, but I got an undergraduate degree in Spanish literature after I had come back from serving an LDS mission in Argentina. I married my wife. We were married in the Los Angeles Temple in California, and then I went to law school in Salt Lake City, Utah. Spent a couple of years clerking for a couple of judges, and then have spent I don't know, 8 years or something like that in private practice in here in the Washington D.C. area.
Hmm. And that's where you're currently this you're a lawyer, right? At this
Yeah,
point,
yeah. I'm a
you were
lawyer.
clerking
I
for a
do.
while, and now you're a lawyer for full time.
Yeah, yeah. I'm a lawyer. Do boring civil litigation.
Really? Oh, I thought okay. That's interesting. Well, let's get into some of your story now and your conversion, and
Sure.
let's start sort of at the beginning. I want to again point people to the book to get the full story.
Yeah.
But I mean, one question that I think arises immediately is what sort of set it off. Like you grew up, in a Mormon family. You went to temple. You like every Sunday. You even describe what that was like in the book. You do. You grow up this way. You were a missionary. At what point did you start to question things?
Yeah, it really started in when I was in law school, and I do want to emphasize we were a very devout family. My parents are still very devout, faithful Mormons, very good people. And one of the things that I think I'm so grateful to them for was teaching me, if there's nothing else that I took from my parents, it was that religion is a serious matter. It's a real thing.
Mm.
And my parents are not are not relativists in any sense. They have deeply held convictions, and that was really formative to me. And while I had certainly some struggles as a teenager, get into in the book, I became deeply converted to Mormonism toward the end of high school. And I think it's important. I want to maybe describe that a little bit before I get to the cracks, because it makes more sense if you understand a little bit about Mormon sort of epistemology, because it's a very integral part of the theology of the church. So for Mormonism, a central component is that to know the truth of the claims of the Mormon church is a matter primarily of receiving personal revelation from God on that subject through the power of the Holy Ghost. In the Book of Mormon, toward the end of the book, there's a passage written, putatively by an ancient American prophet named Moroni, and he sort of breaks the fourth wall and urges the reader that if you are sincere and if you ask God with a sincere heart, that God will manifest the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon to you by the power of the Holy Ghost. And then it says, and by the power of the Holy Ghost, you may know the truth of all things. And the way this sort of cashes out in practice and in Mormon theology is this is sort of an event or even a series of events that are highly internal and highly subjective. Of sort of the best way to describe it is when one is kind of praying to know the Book of Mormon is true, or praying to know that Joseph Smith was a prophet, or something along those lines, that you feel this, what they call a burning in the bosom, this sort of highly kind of elevated emotional state, a sense of peace and well-being, and that this is kind of the thing you're looking for. This is how you know that it's true. It's not a matter of figuring it out as a matter of logic or as a matter of history, but it's primarily this experience that they call receiving a testimony from the Holy Ghost that it's true. And I had that experience when I was about to, I was finishing up high school, and I'm about to get prepared to go and be a Mormon missionary. And it was just sort of struggling with a lot of stuff internally, and had a moment in my bedroom, really sincerely praying to God, and then just having this experience. I opened the Book of Mormon and I read some passages out of the 4th chapter of Mosiah, and they just spoke to me. It just felt like it was speaking to me. And I just had this overwhelming sense of peace and this kind of elevated emotional state, and was crying. And I thought, oh, like, this is it. This is this thing that I've been taught my whole life, have been sort of enculturated, that this is what I've been looking for. And in that context, when you're raised in that context, it's a very powerful experience, and it forms a very tight a connection that Mormons are very reticent to question, because this is sort of God spoke to you and told you this was true, and that's really the fundamental basis of belief in Mormonism. And then that same principle sort of plays out in the church's teaching kind of throughout your life, of what we might think about as as a Catholic, thinking about like discernment or something, of trying, we pray, we want to know God's will, and we may even sense that we perceive God communicating with us through one means or another to guide us. This principle is very sort of heightened in Mormonism. and you are sort of taught to sort of continually be seeking these kinds of experiences, even over relatively mundane life decisions. And so you become very tied up with this idea, this sense that God is kind of constantly communicating with you and leading you and guiding you and directing you. And so I think that's like an important foundational principle, because my first kind of cracks in my faith as a Mormon were not from, reading something that I found very troubling historically or doctrinally, but they began because I get into this in the book. I won't belabor it, but when I was in law school, I received a blessing from a church leader, one of my local church leaders, and those blessings are very much sort of in the world of Mormonism. God is speaking through this person to you. It's an inspired communication, and there were some very kind of specific promises made to me in that moment. And I had that same, this feeling I had many times as a Mormon, this overwhelming sense of like, yes, this is right. This is true. And then that, like, in a couple of months later, most certainly definitively did not happen. and it was,
what was promised did not happen.
So yeah, exactly. And that, as silly as it was about like how I was doing in school, and I get into that, but the kind of personal subjective experience, the way I wrote it is because I know it will resonate with Mormons who read those accounts will understand what I'm talking about when I said I had these feelings and experiences, and then I had that same experience over, an event that turns out to not be true, to not be the case, a promise that does not come to be. And I can't even describe how devastating it was at the time. It was a really dark time. I got very depressed over it. And it was in that state that I think is kind of the first moment that opened up my reason a little bit to saying, okay, look, this experience that I had that was so disappointing was indistinguishable to me from experiences I had had when I prayed over the Book of Mormon or the, prophetic mission of Joseph Smith. What if these experiences were not God? What if it was just me? Right. And kind of for the first time in my life, I became sincerely open to that possibility through that experience. And it was in that context that I decided, I'd been aware of a lot of issues. There wasn't anything about Mormon history or claims about Mormon doctrine that I hadn't heard generally at some level through my life. But at the time, so this would have been around 2012 or 2013, there's something else kind of going on in the Mormon world. And that is, there's a lot of like news reports going on about people leaving the LDS Church over troubling historical issues. It's in the news. There were a couple of very prominent Mormon like bloggers who were excommunicated from the church for on their blogs, kind of like really discussing these kinds of difficult issues in Mormonism. And I was living in Salt Lake City, which is a very funny place. You can't escape kind of the vibe of Mormonism in Salt Lake City. And it's very much a city divided culturally. There are sort of a lot of very faithful Mormons, and then there are a lot of people who are not Mormon, and a lot of them who don't exactly like the church's, political influence or those kinds of things. And I had certainly, been hearing about these issues in the church's history, and around the same time, the LDS Church, I think, coming to a bit of a realization that the age of the internet is just inescapable, and access to information about the church's history was just very proliferated among their members, so that you could gain access to stuff that, 10 or even 10 years before that, if you wanted to read a scholarly non-Mormon account of Joseph Smith's life, you have to go find one of the very few niche books on, that exist on that in some library or in some very niche scholarly journals that deal with these kinds of issues. But with the internet, this stuff just became, it was everywhere. It just starts to proliferate. Mm-hmm. And I think that this started to have a negative impact with a lot of particularly younger, 45 and under crowd starting to leave the church. And in response to that, the LDS Church put out a series of essays, I think starting in 2013. And these essays were kind of a first attempt at acknowledging a lot of these historical issues that a lot of times growing up you were told were lies or gross mischaracterizations about Joseph Smith, or the like. And then you start to read these things. So I'm in this state and I'm like, okay, I'm going to take a look. I want to know if this is true. If it weren't true, I'd really want to know that. And so I start reading this stuff and, reading the church make these concessions about some of these things, the extent and kind of really deep nature of, say, Joseph Smith and his family and his contemporaries' involvement in folk magic, and how deeply that is connected to the Book of Mormon's historical underpinnings of how it came about. And you sort of see the church saying like, yeah, this stuff happened, but, sort of giving an explanation was very jarring. It was jarring to me. I think it was jarring to a lot of people at the time. And that's that first moment of like this panicky feeling of, wow, this may be really not be true.
Yeah. Oh no. Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
I mean, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to basically tie everything that you said back together. And I did want to go back to some of the earlier stories just because your entire story is just fascinating. One of the things I actually really appreciated about your book, you talked about it just now, is the sort of the role that testimony plays, right? And you have you're almost using like a technical term for a testimony here, where you're getting this really emotional experience that is being confirmed to you through the witness of the Holy Spirit. And you even tell that to people that you're trying to evangelize, right? And on your mission and stuff, like this is a major way that you evangelize, is telling people, hey, read the book and it's going to witness to you. But dude, your story is just I want people to buy the book, so I don't want to give too much information out. But the story is so compelling from the beginning. It's because you're not necessarily on board with everything Mormonism when you're younger. In your teenage years, you fall away for a little bit, but then you come back on track, and then you go on this mission, and on your mission you go to Argentina. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yep.
You're in Argentina. You're held at gunpoint at one point. You're your story is just incredible, and then you come back, and then you are trying to do the proper Mormon thing. And then you something happens in your normal life, where something that someone told you earlier, where they were like, yeah, your grades are going to be perfect basically. And then that doesn't happen. And then you're like, well, wait a second. I had that same experience, which by the way, I've had a similar experience because I grew up charismatic, and that was actually a really big thing for us too, was the sort of experiences that you have during worship and stuff. And there's a lot of similarities actually between the charismatic movement and what you've been describing as what happens in the Mormon church. But I've had experiences like that too, where I thought God told me to marry somebody. That was another thing I wanted to talk about, is how you mentioned that in the book, and how your wife, because you were you met her at first and you were like, this is perfect, this is great, this is amazing. And then you had this moment where you were like, actually, I shouldn't marry this person. You thought you heard God say no, but then you wake up the next day and you're like, and then you like confirm it, right? You had like a restless night of sleep, then you wake up the next day and then you have the opposite feeling, and then you're like, oh yeah, this is definitely what I need to do. And you have these sort of conflicting like subjective experiences, and what do you do with that type of stuff? How do you determine if you're just going on feelings and stuff like that? How do you determine what's true? But in your case, I think you had this other experience where it literally contradicted what this other person told you, and so that opened you up to be like, well, maybe all of this is just bogus. But then once you started to look into things at a much deeper level, and you started to really think about like, is it really actually possible that this stuff is false? And some of the stuff that you talk about in the book it blew my mind. Like I had no idea how deep, like you just mentioned it, the sort of magical context of the Book of Mormon, and how that's now recognized by Mormon church leaders. Whereas this was the context, and then it later sort of shifted and became more of a religious context. But originally it started out as like this treasure-seeking, like magical journey that Joseph Smith was on, and actually sent other people on. And then it eventually got turned into this religious thing. Let's talk more about that, the sort of magical context of the Book of Mormon, or feel free to pick up on anything else. That I've said.
So I think just for people who are interested in this, the seminal scholarly work on this is by a man named D. Michael Quinn, rest his soul. He passed away, I think, in 2021. He was a faithful Mormon, faithful Latter-day Saint. He studied at Yale and was a trained historian, and went and he worked for a time with in the church's history department, and during the 70s and 80s was involved with sort of a branch of people in Mormonism who were trying to be a little bit more, open about the church's history. And he wrote a book called now I'm going to blank on the name of the book. It is
I love when that happens, especially when you're live.
I think it's Magic in the Early Mormon Worldview. Mm-hmm. And it's a tome. It is a thick, dense, scholarly book. And he situates, Mormonism comes about with Joseph Smith really in the 1820s and 30s is kind of the original time period. And we're in the Northeast in rural New York. And he situates kind of the historical context there. It's really funny because it wasn't unique to Joseph Smith and his family. It was very prevalent among kind of a lot of people. Benjamin Franklin.
So much so that it was even outlawed, right?
Yeah. There were statutes prohibiting this type of behavior, and even almost 100 years before that, Benjamin Franklin, in one of his papers, sort of comments on this phenomenon about these people who will go off into the woods at night, claiming and believing that there are these, silver mines and golden treasures buried in the earth all over the place, and that they're protected by these kind of mischievous guardian spirits, and that you have to go through these kind of specific magical incantations in order to kind of bewitch the spirit and hold on to the treasure so that people can dig it up. And there's this very common phenomenon among all of them that if you screw something up, the treasure will sink deeper into the earth. And so they somehow never find it. And so Benjamin Franklin writes about this, almost 100 years before Joseph Smith. But in his time, he and his family and his associates are strong believers in things like dowsing rods, and not just, a dowsing rod, for people who aren't familiar, is, you would take like a Y-shaped stick, and they would hold it, and it might twitch. Sometimes they would use them to locate water or something, but they also would use them to like locate these buried treasures, that they saw this as kind of a magical kind of gift. Another thing is the belief in seer stones, that one can take a stone and look into the stone and see things, find lost items, or see these treasures. And Joseph Smith, from a very young age, gains a reputation as kind of the town seer. And he and his father engage in this a lot, and are even hired out and enter into contracts with people to form treasure companies. And Joseph Smith would claim
And
to
this is
be
all
able.
documented, right, in
Oh
history.
yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. Another D. Michael Quinn's book is meticulously, absurdly researched. And you can also find, I have the series here, another, probably, I think, the person who knows more about early Mormonism than any other human being on the face of the earth alive today. His name is Dan Vogel, who is an independent scholar and a heavyweight in early Mormon history. He has a series called Early Mormon Documents that is a collection of the primary documents of affidavits from people, letters from people, reminiscences from people. And it's very well documented that Joseph Smith and his family believed these things and did these things. And that, so, he would gaze into his stone and say that there's a spirit that's guarding this treasure in a hill somewhere, and they would go to dig it up. And they never found anything, but it was always because someone screwed up you have to keep you got to keep a sacred silence while you're doing all of these things. And he's engaged in this practice through a kind of, I forget the exact year that he starts doing it, but certainly through 1823, 24, 25, 26, and into 1827. And one of these treasure quests that he claims exists and that he tells his family stories about is that he says in a hill near his home, there is a set of golden plates guarded by a spirit there, this treasure. It's unclear at what point he starts saying that it has a record on it, that it has historical information. But him and a group of people are trying to get this treasure for a number of years. And what happens is in 1826, Joseph Smith is arrested in South Bainbridge, New York, and taken to the historical record's kind of unclear, but he's taken to some kind of preliminary hearing before a judge, and there are several witnesses because there's a statute that prohibits glass looking, among other things. I think the technical term was that you couldn't be a disorderly person, but the definition of disorderly person covered kind of like palm reading and glass looking and these kinds of superstitious or fraudulent kinds of practices. And so he's taken to court, and the transcript is very curious because half of the people in his company believe this. And that's part of his defense, is they're like, no, he's not faking it. He can really do this. We believe him. And it's unclear historically how it's resolved, whether he's convicted or not. But it's a pretty big watershed moment for him in his early life. And around the same time, he has met a young woman named Emma Hale on one of his treasure quests for a man named Josiah Stoll. And he meets Emma Hale, and her father, Isaac Hale, is very opposed to Joseph's manner of making a living, and he does not like that Joseph has taken an interest in his daughter, and Joseph wants to marry her, and Isaac says no, and Joseph and Emma run off and elope against their Emma's parents' wishes. And then there's a recording of a very highly emotional confrontation between Isaac Hale and Joseph Smith when they kind of come back from the elopement, in which it's I think it's secondhand, but it's there's a lot about it that's well documented otherwise, that Isaac Hale sort of says, you've stolen my daughter, and you're this scurrilous kind of treasure seeker, and just kind of rakes him over the coals, and that Joseph promises him that he's going to stop doing this. By some accounts, he admits that he was deceiving people, and he promises he's not going to do it. And Dan Vogel, his theory, which I think is a pretty plausible one, is that it's in this time period that Joseph Smith kind of negotiates a way that he can keep his promise to his father-in-law, but also not give up this reputation that he has. And it's around this time that this treasure digging project converts and starts to take on religious overtones. And so Joseph Smith starts describing not a guardian spirit, but an angel. And not just a golden treasure, but a record that, pertains to the gospel. And that God has called him to take this record out of the earth and translate it. And so sort of bit by bit, this project kind of evolves into one of a religious nature. But when you read the earliest accounts, even of people who become close associates of Joseph Smith in founding Mormonism, who serve as witnesses to these golden plates, like Martin Harris, their early accounts of what was going on are sort of inextricably tied with this treasure seeking thing. Now, here's the real rub. I'm sure your audience is like, where's he going with this? This is where the big issue comes up. Okay, the way that Joseph Smith would scry for treasure, that's the term they would use, is he took a stone. Scry, yeah.
Okay.
That's what they call it. It's a scrying for treasures, to look in these stones. And he took a stone and he would put it in his hat. And then
real quick, are these stones opaque or transparent?
They were different. The one that Joseph Smith preferred to use was opaque. It was brown. You can find a picture of it. The LDS Church actually took it out of their archives and put it on display in maybe 2014 or 15 for the first time.
You got to ask why that's even happening in the first place. With are there any other instances of this happening in the Jewish scriptures? People using
I mean, they Mormonism starts to tie the concept of the seer stone to the Urim and Thummim mentioned in the Old Testament, which I think by some scholars' accounts are some sort of divination tool. But the kind of the issue becomes he puts the stone in his hat and he'll look in it and says he can see the treasure and these things in the stone. When Joseph Smith goes to translate the golden plates that he claims he has now taken out of the earth, the way that he does it is not by setting these records in front of him and looking at them and, translating them by some ancient language that he's aware of. Rather, he takes the stone and he puts it in his hat. All accounts of the translation of the Book of Mormon, as we have it, every single one of them, describes Joseph Smith taking the stone, putting it in his hat, putting his face in the hat, and dictating the words of the Book of Mormon while a scribe would write them down. And so that's
nothing
the
to do
point.
with the golden plates.
The golden plates would either purportedly be in the room underneath a cloth. There's a lot of historical debate about what he had under the cloth. Some people think he took a bunch of tin plates and had them hid. He had some object. He brought some object home that he would let people feel through a cloth, and they said it felt like there were metal pages under it. A couple of people got to feel it, but not see it. And usually the plates weren't even in the room, or if they were covered, but he wasn't looking at them. He would look in his hat at the stone.
Mormon apologists will say that there was multiple people that saw these plates. There was 18, I think, one of the top.
So so they claim there are 11 witnesses, and they break them into two categories: the so-called 3 witnesses and the 8 witnesses. And the way it's generally described, I'd refer you. Dan Vogel has a great series on YouTube about the witnesses. That's very informative. So, but before I get to the witnesses, just the last point is, when you're reading this and you learn about the history of kind of the treasure digging stuff, which I was like, well, I don't believe he was really seeing treasure. I don't. I don't personally believe that. But then when you see that the Book of Mormon was dictated with the same process, the same stone, it was like his stone. This is the stone that he used for treasure digging, is the same one that he, puts his face in the hat and
I see.
dictates the words
I
of the
see
Book
the
of Mormon.
connection that
You're
you're
like,
making here.
wait a second. Okay. that seems off. And that's certainly not how, in like artistic presentations you see as a Mormon growing up, that is not how it was ever depicted in like devotional art. They would paint Joseph Smith at a table with the golden plates in front of him. That's the impression that the church very much gave about how it happened. But that's absolutely not how it happened. And so that's very jarring. On the witnesses, so there are three witnesses: David Whitmer, Oliver Cowdery, and Martin Harris. The way it's presented in the first, the Book of Mormon has a couple of introduction pages, and one of them is called the Testimony of the Three Witnesses, and it's like a sworn statement of these three men, in which they claim that an angel came down from heaven and showed them the golden plates, and they say as many as the leaves that said Smith has translated, we have seen them, or something to this effect. And the way it comes off is that, an angel appeared to them and showed them the plates. And that this happened with all three of them at the same time. That's the definite impression you get from this written testimony that was included with the Book of Mormon. But the historical record is much more complicated. That what it really looks like is that Joseph Smith took first, claimed that he received a revelation, and wrote it down. And this revelation tells the witnesses that they're going to see the plates by the power of God. And then they go off into the woods, and Joseph Smith tells them that they need to pray. And so they sit there praying, and nothing is happening. And Martin Harris thinks it's his fault, that he's got some issue and he's causing a problem here. So he gets up and he goes off some distance away. And then at that point, by accounts by David Whitmer later in his life, and I also believe might be some secondhand accounts of people quoting David Whitmer, but for sure David Whitmer later in his life stated that when he looks at what they saw was like a visionary experience. So that they claim that an angel appears and there was a table and he's got the golden plates and he has a bunch of other in the woods and other materials that were also allegedly buried with the plates, a sword, a breastplate, and some other objects. And the way that they describe this, though, is like a supernatural event, and that David Whitmer describes it as not having been with the natural eyes. And there's another kind of historical component that ties into this idea with like seer stones. Another late Mormon scholar, Grant Palmer, who has a book in which he describes this thing called second sight, which is a very common belief in this time about, maybe not to put too fine a point on it, but the belief that kind of, closing your eyes and having a strong imagination of something is real, or that you could see things with your spiritual eyes, that you're not seeing them
so it's like almost realer than a vision.
Yeah,
but like a vision, but it's realer.
I'm not seeing them with my eyes like I see. So Martin Harris, he says more about this later in his life, and he says, I didn't see, the plates like you see this pencil here. I saw them as one sees a city through a hill, or a city through a mountain. And all of these people deeply held these kind of folk magic beliefs about sort of being able to see things. And so the historical record describes the event with the first two as being more supernatural, not so much an angel just like showing you stuff, but more visionary. And Then Joseph Smith goes over with Martin Harris, and Joseph Smith writes about this later and says, I knelt down with Martin Harris, and I think I forget if he tells him what they saw, but he starts praying with Martin Harris, and then Joseph Smith says, and the same vision was opened to my eyes, or he says the same vision was opened to our eyes, at least it was to me. And Martin Harris then began to exclaim, "'Tis enough, 'tis enough, mine eyes have seen." And so the context of the three witnesses really comes off as being not so, hey, I saw an angel come down and show me some physical objects. But as they describe them in later accounts, Martin Harris said, and is independently corroborated by multiple people as having said in a meeting, that he never saw the plates with his natural eyes. And he said no one ever saw the plates with their natural eyes, only with the eyes of the Spirit. And Martin Harris seems to have implicated the 8 witnesses. And I can turn to them for a minute. The 8 witnesses, their description in the Book of Mormon, the testimony sounds very humdrum. They're like, yeah, Joseph Smith showed us the plates and we saw them. But Martin Harris's account, and also I think there's only one account. I think Hiram Smith, Joseph's brother, is in that group, and he said something a bit ambiguous about it. John Whitmer said it was supernatural, that event, and Martin Harris implicated that nobody ever saw them like you and I talk about seeing stuff. And this was very concerning to people when Martin Harris had said it. It caused some problems. But I personally don't believe that anyone ever saw the golden plates ever. I don't think they existed.
Yeah, this actually brings me to a super chat that was just sent in by Maverick Christian. So no Mormon claimed to have seen the golden plates with their natural physical eyes?
That's what my contention is. The historical record for the 8 witnesses is not super good. And Mormon apologists obviously have caused a lot of static around that point, and will claim, no, they did claim to see them with their natural eyes. But
do they overstate the case, you think?
I do think they overstate the case. I'd refer people to Dan Vogel's YouTube series on the witnesses. It is tedious, very long. Dan Vogel is an excellent scholar. They're not the most exciting videos in the world, but they are meticulous and will paint, I think, a correct kind of scholarly historical picture of the events.
Okay. So, man, there's so much to talk about. I mean, one of the things that you bring up in the book that I wanted to discuss, although we'll see if we have time to get into it, is the Salamander controversy. This Salamander letter, which actually, let's talk about that because it ties into the whole magical context and treasure seeker context. Talk about that a little bit, because that is, when I first read that, I had no idea.
Oh yeah, that was a huge scandal. I mean, that was national news. So there's this guy in the 80s named Mark Hoffman, and he gains a reputation in kind of, I don't know what you call it, old document circles. He seems to have a knack for finding some of the just rarest documents you could get your hands on. He claimed to have found and sold to people documents, rare documents, I think one from George Washington. And I think he did legitimately deal in some legitimate, antique documents. But he was Mormon. He gained a particular reputation for being able to find Mormon documents that were very rare. And one of them that he finds is he claims to find a letter written by Martin Harris describing Joseph Smith's visit to the hill Cumorah near his home when he got the plates. And it's a very odd account. It describes Joseph going up onto the hill and a spirit appearing to him and transmogrifying into the form of a salamander, and then zapping Joseph Smith on the head and launching him, 20, 30 feet across the forest. just a very strange account given the traditional Mormon story, which is, Joseph has an angel appear to him in prayer one night, and it tells him he needs to go to the hill. So he goes to the hill every year on this same date, and the angel shows him the plates, and he's not allowed to take them yet, and he needs to be prepared. But this letter just seems totally bizarre to kind of a rank and file Mormon. Like, this is crazy. And what's even crazier is almost everybody in Mormon historical settings, both people who are antagonistic to the church, neutral, and people at the LDS Church, everybody thinks it's real. Everybody thinks it's a historical document. And the LDS Church purchases the Salamander letter from Mark Hoffman, and kind of has to come up with a lot of explanations for, like, why is Martin Harris talking about the angel Moroni being a salamander? Like, this is very weird, and they're kind of struggling to deal with it. And then the real drama kicks in. A bunch of bombs start going off all over the Salt Lake Valley and killing people. Like letter bombs, package bombs, car bombs. And it turns out they all have a connection. All these people have a connection to Mark Hoffman. And, he gets arrested, and it turns out that a number of people had discovered he was an extremely skilled document forger, that he forged all these, these documents everybody would love to find but can't find. He seemed to always have them, that he forged the documents. And he's arrested, and everybody sort of learns the lesson. The Salamander letter was a forgery. But the kind of weird, the weird thing about the situation is that a Mormon, you sit there and you're asked, you kind of find yourself being like, but why did all the Mormon church authorities and their historians, and also the historians who are kind of antagonistic, everybody except for a guy named Gerald Tanner, who was antagonistic to the church, but he was like, I don't think this letter's legit. But pretty much everybody thought it was. And you're like, why? And it's because people knew about this, that was the context in which the Book of Mormon came about. And it has reference. I forget who wrote it. I think it is in an affidavit in a book that was published by a guy named E.B. Howe. I think the book's called Mormonism Unveiled in the 1830s. This guy went and interviewed
the name of the guy. I think I may have the name of the guy. Hang on.
I think it's so there's a letter in or an affidavit, I think, in E.B. Howe's book.
Willard Chase?
Might be Willard Chase. I mean, that's an early Mormon
1833 affidavit.
Yeah.
That upon Joseph's first attempt to recover the plates, he saw the box, something like a toad.
Yeah. So I think the theory was that Hoffman, being in kind of church historical settings with people who were kind of doing the real scholarship and knew about these sorts of things, saw that reference to the toad, and then was able to write a letter that is like, hey, this is consistent with the other historical information that we have. But, that event really, I think, started definitely opening the door to people realizing that the kind of Sunday school version of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon that you were taught is not like what the historical record really says.
Yeah. I mean, the historical context and the sort of magical treasure seeking thing like that, I think actually does go a long way to explain like what we actually see. But maybe we can shift gears a little bit and talk about the Book of Abraham, because I just produced a video on this that has in turn produced a slurry of different response videos. But did that play a part in your deconversion from Mormonism at all, or did that come into play later on, or what's the story?
During the period where I just started reading kind of everything I could get my hands on, I don't want to. For me, there was not like one single thing about that I read that was like, this is the thing.
This is
to me, rather, it was reading a lot of information and reading it in some more scholarly historical contexts that that produced a more persuasive story about what happened and that accounted for more data points than the church's story. And I was like, this makes more sense. And the Book of Abraham definitely figured into that because it fits a similar pattern as to, Joseph Smith's purported ability to translate ancient languages. So for the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith claimed the Book of Mormon was written on the golden plates in Reformed Egyptian, which is not a language that anybody has confirmed is a real one. But in 1834, Joseph Smith comes into contact with a fellow named Michael Chandler. And this is for those who have not seen Cameron's video. You should go watch it. It's a very good video. And he's very interested. This Chandler guy has a number of mummies with papyri. And Joseph Smith buys the mummies and the papyri from him because he declares that some of these papyri contain the writings of the patriarch Abraham, and some of them contain the writings of Joseph of Egypt. And
would you mind explaining a little bit about, like, do you know how he was able to purchase it? Because it was about $2,500, or I think $2,400.
It was $2,400. That's a lot of money.
A lot of money. So yeah, how did he? Because if he grew up poor, how did he gain this wealth?
I don't know exactly what money he used for it. By this time, 1834, the Book of Mormon gets published in 1830, and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is officially organized on April 6th of 1830 and begins to grow pretty rapidly. The movement is garnering a lot of converts, and it's growing. And they move from the Palmyra, New York, kind of upstate New York area, and Harmony, Pennsylvania, and they move to Ohio. And then there also is a Mormon settlement that crops up in Missouri. But they're in Kirtland, Ohio. And by this point, I mean, the church is getting pretty big. I imagine. I don't know where he got the money. Yeah, like the church has money. Joseph Smith, was certainly, once he became I'm not saying, Joseph Smith did all this to make money. I don't know that that's actually the best explanation for why he did what he did. But at that point, he had the means to make a purchase of $2,400 in 1834, which is a tidy sum of money. And he sets off and he creates, from these papyri, and there's historical debate about exactly what happens. I think most historians fall on one side, and then there are a couple of different groups of LDS apologists who try to tell a different story. But I think what most folks say happened is they created a couple of books. It's really two books, but we'll just call them one. We'll call it the Egyptian Alphabet and Grammar, where Joseph Smith and his scribes would copy a character from some of these papyri, and then they would deconstruct each little, I don't think they were hieroglyphic. I think they were hieratic script, or maybe Demotic script. I'm not an Egyptologist, but I know there's three kinds of Egyptian. So they would take the characters and they would kind of deconstruct them into all their little component parts. And then they would write their interpretation of, like, this dot means this, and this little slash means this. And then in the document, you can see they develop this concept of degrees of meaning, where they start to extrapolate even entire paragraphs from a single character. And the work in the Egyptian Alphabet and Grammar, except a small part at the end, is not the contents of the Book of Abraham, but was their attempts at translating some of the other papyri that they had. But at the very end, it starts off with the first couple of verses of the Book of Abraham. And this happens in 1835. And then there's a big pause, a hiatus. And Joseph Smith doesn't pick this project up again until, I think, 1842. And by this point, they've moved to Nauvoo, Illinois. And he starts to publish what he calls the Book of Abraham in periodicals in the Times and Seasons newspaper, which is the church's official newspaper, and of which Joseph Smith was, I believe, the editor-in-chief. and they put it's a purported translation of these characters from the papyri, and it purports to tell a story of Abraham. It contains a lot of unique Mormon doctrine. So Mormonism's belief in a plurality of gods, the sort of polytheism or henotheism that is a unique feature of Mormonism, comes out of the Book of Abraham. The belief in the pre-existence of spirits comes out of the Book of Abraham. So they publish this, and it becomes canonized scripture for Mormons. And in the book, Joseph Smith includes two facsimiles of some of the, I don't know what you call them, hieroglyphs or whatever in the book. There's sort of a circular image, and then there's an image of a body on a like couch sort of thing. Joseph Smith says it's an altar, and that there's a priest over about to stab the person on this altar, and he gives a translation of all of these, but the actual Egyptian is there in the image. So flash forward to Joseph Smith is killed by a mob in Carthage jail in 1844. The majority of Mormons follow Brigham Young over to Utah, across the plains, including some of my ancestors who lived in and around the Nauvoo area at this time. They come across the plains and they settle in Utah. And the original papyri stay back and are believed to have been destroyed in the Great Fire in Chicago in 1871. But in the interim, I think before Joseph Smith starts this, I believe the Rosetta Stone had actually been, at least initially, kind of cracked. And so in Europe, Egyptology is really taking off, but there's not a broad knowledge of Egyptian in the United States when Joseph Smith begins this project. But as time goes on, Egyptologists, of course, take interest in the Book of Abraham, and they see Joseph Smith's purported translation, and they're like, that's not what that says, because there is Egyptian facsimiles in the Book of Abraham, and they're like, what he's saying it says is not what it says. And then flash forward to 1967, and someone at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City discovers that Joseph Smith's papyri are, in fact, in a collection at the Met. And they arrange to have these materials returned to the LDS Church. It's of great interest, obviously. And by this point, Egyptologists can look at the Book of Abraham scrolls, and they are deciphered to be ordinary funerary texts. I think one is called the Permit of Hor, or the Permit of Breathings. It belonged to a man named Hor, and the other is, I think, a part of the Book of the Dead. I forget. But these are ordinary funerary texts. The image is not of Abraham on a sacrificial altar about to be killed by a wicked pagan priest, which is the translation Joseph Smith gives of this. But it's somebody lying on a funerary couch with, I think, the god Anubis or something standing over him. And
I've seen some Mormons say that actually it's a person. I wish I could put the thing on the screen, but you guys just need to go watch the video. But someone was saying that because his arms are up in the air, that means that the person was still alive, and so this couldn't have been like a standard funerary scene because the guy would have been dead.
I don't think
in the actual image, if you look at it, his arms are kind of lifted in the air a little bit.
Yeah, so there's a hiccup with the image. The image contained of that scene, the actual papyri are torn. You can go look this up, but the papyri are torn. That image is incomplete and was sketched in by somebody. So that image is a stock image from Egyptian funerary texts that would match up with many, many other of these documents that have been found, and it was torn. And somebody, I don't know if it's Joseph Smith, if it's somebody at his direction, sketches in the remaining image in those holes. So what the image actually looked like maybe is up for some debate, but it most likely looked just like the many other copies of these texts that exist. But if you want the real kind of the best Book of Abraham treatment, Again, a lot of these scholars are passing away, unfortunately, but Dr. Robert Rittner passed away from cancer a couple of years ago. Was a very acclaimed Egyptologist at the University of Chicago, and has, I think, written some of the definitive work on the Book of Abraham. He published a book on
He's
it.
got some interviews on YouTube as well.
Yeah. Impeccable Egyptologist. There, to my knowledge, there are only two, I could be wrong about this, but there are kind of like two people with Egyptology training who continue to make arguments in favor of the Book of Abraham. They are LDS apologists as well, Karen Muhlestein and John Gee. Dan Vogel has a 12-part video series on the Book of Abraham, or a 10-part video series that's like 13 or 14 hours long in total. And he has a thorough response to the kind of apologetic claims that's very much worth watching. And I think
tackle if you don't mind, let's tackle one of those claims, which is that he wasn't actually doing translation. It was more like revelation. Translation, because that it literally says in his notebooks, it says a translation of, so the obvious implication there is that he's trying to translate. This is a linguistic process, right? Yeah. But then Mormon apologists will be like, well, actually, he thought he was translating the Book of Mormon too, and that was more revelatory, and so he's got this sort of loosey-goosey definition of translation, and so it's not necessarily a problem. That's just how he's using the term in this sort of odd way. It doesn't mean that he's doing strict translation from one language to another. He's more doing something like revelation. How would you respond to that?
I think kind of there are a couple of responses. At one level, I would just say I don't see any indication in Joseph Smith's statements when he talks about translating the Book of Abraham, I won't get into these other examples, but reports of him translating the Kinderhook plates, reports of a request by a pastor that he translate a Greek Psalter. I don't think there's really any reason for us to invent a new meaning to translate other than what I think any ordinary person would have understood exactly what it was that Joseph Smith was claiming to do. When he said translate, he meant translate. The bigger problem, I think, for the Book of Abraham is what it kind of seems that the LDS community has started to socialize or maybe even settle on, which is what they call the catalyst theory. But if you unpack this, I think it's just in the context of kind of the rest of the issues, I don't personally think it's particularly credible or persuasive. And I don't think it's something that they're out kind of actively trying to persuade people in evangelizing about, because I think an ordinary disinterested person is going to say, I don't believe that. So let me explain. The catalyst theory is something to the effect of, yes, it is true. The papyri have literally nothing to do with Abraham. They're from Ptolemaic Egypt, many, many, many hundreds of years after the time of Abraham, and they have nothing to do with Abraham or Abrahamic religion. But Joseph Smith saw them, and they were a catalyst for him to receive the revelation of the Book of Abraham, even if Joseph Smith and everyone around him thought that he was actually translating them. If that's the level that we're at, I just personally don't think that is a reasonable or persuasive argument. Even accounting for, the possibility of the divine, that in context to say, look, Joseph Smith looked at something and everybody, he told everybody he was translating it. He believed he had the gift of translation. There's lots of documented accounts of saying he's got the gift of translation. And he tells you he's translating it. If what we really mean is he can look at one thing and it just inspires him to write some stuff. At minimum, I think reasonable people would claim that's a much less persuasive argument that this book is of divine origin. For me to believe that in the context of somebody who does this. There's another instance. So it's not that the catalyst theory, that you can't make the argument that Joseph Smith maybe might have believed that. So there's one of the sections of LDS scripture called the Doctrine and Covenants, which is a compilation of revelations given to Joseph Smith about church doctrine and the building up of the church and how the church would be organized and sending people on missions and sometimes rebuking Joseph Smith or other people around him or resolving certain controversies, which purport to speak in the name of the Lord in these revelations. But one of them, I forget the section number. One of them is very curious, and it purports to be a translation of a scrap of a papyrus written by John the Revelator. But there isn't any indication that Joseph Smith ever claimed that he had the piece of paper. And I think Michael Quinn might talk about this and a few other people, but there's evidence that's sort of indicating, again, he looks in his seer stone and says, like, I can see the document, and then I can translate the document. And that's one set of claims. Okay, fair enough. I think for my purposes, that's not the faith I was taught, nor the faith on which those weren't the premises on which I went to God and said, is this true? I went to him on a very different set of premises about the nature of the founding of the church and these various books of scripture. And so, I think if that's kind of the new pitch, I don't think that's a particularly persuasive pitch.
Let's talk about, if you don't mind, let's talk about, because you mentioned it, and I promise you guys, we are going to get to his conversion to Catholicism. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. I mean, there's just so much to talk about, and I feel like I could sit here and talk for days. Let's talk about the circumstances of his death. Okay, yeah. How exactly did he die, and does it look anything like what happened with the apostles, right? Where the apostles were very sincere. What happened with his death?
So this is a tricky question. So I maybe don't. I don't know if I've completely settled my mind on what I think are the internal motivations of Joseph Smith. I think one plausible theory, and I'll get to. I promise I'll get to the actual answer to your question. Dan Vogel has a book, a biography of Joseph Smith from 2004, that posits what he calls the pious fraud theory. And in essence, the theory is, at some point, Joseph Smith sincerely became convinced he had some kind of divine mission. But Vogel marshals pretty extensive evidence that Joseph Smith believed in a sort of situational ethics in which it was appropriate to deceive people in order to achieve greater ends. And the greatest end would be bringing people to God. And because there's a lot of activity from Joseph Smith that is hard to account for on just a pure, like, this guy totally knew that, he was just making stuff up and he was running a fraud his entire life. I do think that there is something, maybe people don't explore enough the I'm in too deep hypothesis. Certainly we can all think of instances in, modern time of people running significant frauds, financial frauds and otherwise, where people just get in too deep. And
you keep going. You have to keep going.
Yeah. And at some level, it's like, if Joseph Smith really did not believe anything he was doing, if he just decided, what's he going to do? Just like fess up? By 1840, he has founded this, like the second largest city in Illinois. Nauvoo is huge. It is a political powerhouse. He has political power. He has many tens of thousands of followers who are loyal to him, who have moved from Europe, who have moved across the country, who have sacrificed. I don't know exactly what it is that you would do.
Maybe it'd also be good to. I was going to say, maybe it'd also be good to just mention, like, to kind of back up your theory, because we're talking about like his death and stuff, but we're talking about maybe some of his motivations. But I think to kind of back up your theory a little bit, I think he had seen some success with the Book of Mormon. And based on that success, he went and kind of got deeper and deeper. But maybe we should talk about, like, why was the Book of Mormon even, like, successful in the first place. You mentioned that in the book, how it's sort of very, very heavily based on the King James version of the Bible.
Yeah, I think part of the reason, there's a lot of complex reasons for its success. Religious seekerism and kind of restorationist movements. Joseph Smith's movement was not unique in that sense. There are a lot of different religions kind of springing up in that time period of people, involved in religious revivals, and a lot of a need of a belief of restoring, and so it attracted people. The Book of Mormon, part of its attractiveness could be, its main source is pretty clearly the King James Bible. Much of its content is taken verbatim or near verbatim, or paraphrased, or very kind of loosely elaborated upon from the Bible. But it also resolves questions that were very popular at the time, the origin of the Native Americans. So it was widely believed at the time that the Native Americans, it was a common belief. I don't know about widely, but it was a common belief that the Native Americans were, a lost tribe of Israel, or had immigrated from Israel. That was like a pretty common view. There were books written espousing that view. So it kind of answers to that. It also, kind of auspiciously is concerned with a number of Protestant theological debates going on in that time period. Infant baptism, the kind of the nature of God, kind of like a host of these issues. A lot of the preaching and the response of the preaching is very characteristic of 19th century Protestant revival. And so, if people kind of have these kinds of beliefs, you can see why they might be predisposed to join up with Mormonism. And to kind of return to the point, earlier, Joseph Smith's death, by this point, kind of the event that really precipitates his death, he's involved in a lot of controversy in Nauvoo. There is a claim that's still debated today that he tried to have the governor of Missouri assassinated. He has a very powerful political force in Nauvoo. He launches a campaign for president of the United States. He's also secretly, but among a trusted kind of cohort of people, he is practicing polygamy at the time. And a number of people, as they start to become aware of these things, he makes a lot of enemies. And one of them, William Law, who's at one time a close associate of Joseph Smith, defects from the church. They form a newspaper in Nauvoo called the Nauvoo Expositor, and they start to print a bunch of stuff about what Joseph Smith is up to. And I believe this includes the practice of polygamy, which is being rumored heavily at the time, in particular because of one of Joseph's other close kind of companions, a guy named John C. Bennett, is also practicing it and maybe not keeping all the rules that Joseph Smith says he has to, and it's causing a lot of problems. And Joseph Smith catches wind of what the Nauvoo Expositor is going to publish, and as mayor of Nauvoo, he orders, he's also the commander of the Nauvoo Legion. I think he orders folks to go in and they destroy the printing press, and this causes a big problem.
And this actually happened historically.
Yes, this happened. And Mormons know that he destroyed the Nauvoo Expositor. That's not a secret. And he gets arrested. I forget what the charges are. There might be a treason charge against him that gets into like a whole nother area that we don't have time to go into, related to his involvement in a thing called the Council of 50, which was like a blending of kind of political theocratic ideas that he was working on with the religion that was making some people nervous. But he gets arrested, and he's in a small jail in Carthage, Illinois. And the accounts of Joseph Smith are of what happens in the hours up to his death are, they don't obviously open you up to the claim that he um, like realizes his goose is cooked. He is very depressed. He has his companion John Taylor sing a hymn called "A Poor Wayfaring Man of Grief" for him. They're sullen. They drink some wine and smoke some pipes to try and chill out, because they all kind of have a foreboding sense that something good is not going to happen. And then a mob storms the jail, and Joseph Smith was, I think, maybe concerned about some of these issues. He had somebody smuggle in a couple of pistols into their room. There's a gunfight through the door. His brother Hiram is shot, falls over, and Joseph Smith runs. I'm getting some of the details wrong of exactly the order that it happens in. I think he might be shot once. He goes to the window. There's some claim that he throws up a Masonic sign because he knows there's a lot of Masons out there. He's a member of the Masonic Lodge at this point. Or maybe he just throws up his hands, but he's shot from the window. He falls out of the second story window and dies there in the courtyard of the jail. So, I wouldn't characterize his death as one about. So here's maybe the kind of nub of like apologetic dispute might be, is he dying for his witness of his religious work? I don't know that you can really clearly make that case. People were not up there, to kill him because they were like, you need to deny that you're a prophet of God and you need to deny the Book of Mormon, etc. They're up there over these other things. Like, we hear that you're, sleeping with the wives of some dozen, you're sleeping with all these women. You've just destroyed the Nauvoo Expositor. You've destroyed a printing press that was trying to publish unfavorable stuff about you. There's just a lot of anger and suspicion about him.
Mm-hmm. This guy needs to go.
Yeah.
It wasn't because he was this big prophet and it wasn't a murder case.
No, I say that with all respect. I have a great deal of respect and love. All my family are Mormon. My wife's family are still Mormon. I love Mormon people, and I learned a lot of great things and a lot of great principles over, my decades as a Mormon. But, I wouldn't characterize as I understand and think about martyrdom. I am disinclined to call Joseph Smith's death martyrdom, but even if it were, I don't think the case. So you hear this a lot. Like, there will be debates, about, we believe the apostles in part. We believe their testimony of the resurrection because of their willingness to die and their ultimate, death for the faith. These are all. I think that a lot of the arguments. I heard Jacob Hansen debate Trent Horn. What was that? Maybe a year ago or something on Matt Fradd's podcast on Pints with Aquinas. And, there was argument about, a bunch of these arguments that you're making against Mormonism are really going to refute Catholicism. And I just think there's a very great distinction. It would be one thing if we possessed the amount of documentation about early Mormonism that we have, while it's not perfect and it's not as much as anybody would like, dwarfs the amount of documentary information that we have about the apostolic era, right? Like, we've got a handful of letters from St. Paul, and we've got the Gospels, and we've got the letters of John and of Peter. We've got a handful of documents.
Which is amazing that we even have that.
It is amazing that we have that. Look, if someone could the analogy, because I see a lot of Mormons who have left Mormonism and who kind of go off into, secularism, atheism, and they reject Christianity because they see the development. And I don't like to use that word because I like development. I'm a big I have a great devotion to John Henry Newman. And when I say development in this context, I don't mean it in its sort of term of art context in the Catholic world. But when they see the development of how Mormonism comes about, I think they are far too quick and hasty to be like, something like that just must have happened with Christianity, right? The reality is we don't have anywhere near a kind of documentary basis where we can like actually, you can make reasonable judgments about Joseph Smith's motivation because we have immense amounts of material written by this man and other people's talking about him, and we can make judgments about the character of dozens of characters in early Mormonism because we have troves of historical data that when I think you look at them and they cast what I think is not a compelling claim that this comes from God. I just don't think the comparisons are apt.
Why don't we now turn and talk about your conversion to Catholicism and what the events that sort of led to that. So one question I've got is, why didn't you become secular or an atheist? Why did you maintain your belief in God's existence before we get to particulars about theology?
Yeah, I mean, my honest answer, like not trying to appear overly pious or anything, but at some level, it's God's grace. But for the grace of God go I. I don't know why God moved my heart and my mind to hold on to certain basic things. To certainly, I had questions about God because my entire conception about God is formed in the context of Mormon, theology, like God the Father has a body and there might have been a God before him and before him and before him. And, we can become gods and all of this stuff. And I guess I always just had some sense that that God is real. And there was a time where, I certainly was not interested in joining any other church. I kind of, I hung around. I would still go to church with my wife to help the kids. But I started doing a lot of reading, and what really, I kind of just had an idea of like, well, I'll just be eclectic me and believe in my version of the universe that I choose to believe in. And in this process, I came across, I think I talk about this some in the book. I tried to piece it together with my Google search history, which I had never deleted. So I could like go through it and be like, what was I looking at and doing that I somehow stumble across both a reference to John Henry Newman's essay on the development of Christian doctrine and the concept of the church fathers. And I can't piece together exactly where either of those things came from. And I picked up a copy of John Henry Newman's book, and I didn't read, all I read was the first chapter about his kind of theoretical point about development of ideas. And it doesn't really touch on Christian history or anything. I picked up the book and read the rest of it later. But I was interested in this idea because I was still trying to think through issues in Mormonism and how you might square that circle. But I came across this reference to the church fathers who I'd never heard of. I had no exposure to at all. And I got on, you can see them. Sorry, I'm going to point the wrong direction. You can see them here behind my head. I got on eBay and I found this, this is a very popular Protestant translation of the church fathers. And I got them for a steal. I got them for very, very cheap relative to what they tend to cost. And I remember just thinking like, I'd just be interested in reading. I didn't know we had writings from the kind of first set of people after the New Testament. And I said to a Catholic friend of mine, in fact, I was like, yeah, I bought these. I'm not really interested in what happened, like by the time of Augustine and the Council of Nicaea when the Catholic Church got its hands on all this. Like, I don't, not really interested. I'm sure from that point it all looks very Catholic. But so I opened the first volume. Actually, I have it right here. I still have all my tabs on it from that period of study, and I didn't have any guides or treatises or anything. I would come home at night and I would just start reading from the beginning through. And I did a little research and saw, there are a couple documents that are early that they didn't include in this volume, like the Didache and some others that they have in different volumes. So, I start reading these, and I still consider myself Christian. But as I read it, I was like, well, these people, they're kind of the earliest set of Christians, and they believe a bunch of things that I don't believe. How is it that I call myself Christian? Looking at, here are these people, and a lot of these people, right? You're reading through like the martyrdom account of Polycarp and these things. You're like, yeah, these are the folks who got it real bad from the Roman Empire, right? These people in this earliest era. So they are suffering greatly, immensely, being tortured and dying for a set of beliefs that I don't hold. But they seemed very clear to me on reading. So one of them that, obviously jumped out to me very early on was the doctrine of the real presence. It just seemed very apparent to me reading through these documents, like, oh, these people believe that the Eucharist is the body and blood of our Lord. And that's not something that is believed in LDS teaching, but I was like, these people definitely believe that. And there were other things as a non-Trinitarian, the Trinity just leaps off the page. I think the way I would describe it, and the way I describe it in the book, is in the kind of the early, the Holy Spirit does not get a lot of theological treatment until a little bit later in early Christian history. But it seemed very clear to me from early Christian writers, Justin Martyr, others. I'm not going to name them all off. We all know who those folks are. That they held two propositions or three propositions at the same time, that they all clearly believe this. One, there is one God, right? They are so adamant that they are monotheists, and it shows up in all kinds of, in kind of disputations that they have. So Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho the Jew, right? Which is like a dialogue with, probably was a real conversation, but then he kind of elaborated on it and writes it down later. And there were accusations like, hey, you're not a monotheist. And there is this very clear insistence, we are monotheists. There is one God. They quote the Shema Israel from Deuteronomy 6. There's one God. It's also very clear to these people that Jesus is God and that the Father is God. They call them both God, but it's also clear that there's a difference between the Father and the Son in these writings. And it was like, as you start to read, the influence of Logos theology in these early writers, it just kind of clicked, like, oh, I see. I get what these, Trinitarians were always yelling at me while I was a missionary. Like what they were always telling me, Protestants and Catholics and all these people were telling me I was really wrong about God. And it wasn't that I believed the Trinity was true, but that it seemed very clear to me that these people believed that, and that this idea of the Trinity was not some, later invention, under Constantine or something like that, and it did not come out of the Council of Nicaea, or wasn't like invented there. And that the concept of apostolic succession also jumped out. Was just like, oh, this comes out very strong in Ignatius of Antioch and Irenaeus of Lyon. I know there's a lot of disputes, especially with the Orthodox, on Irenaeus's passage when he says, we can cut through all the clamor because we know, that all Christians need to, obey that most ancient and most holy, venerable Church of Rome, and all have to be in agreement with it. And I just read that and was like, wait a second. And I kind of had a realization that at some level, it seemed to me, while it wasn't that Catholicism, I saw every jot and tittle of Catholicism in the earliest writings of the church, but rather I'm reading this and was like, it's just a brute historic fact that the Catholic Church is this thing. Like, that's where it came from. That's what it is. They espouse the views of these people, and like what theological significance I attach to that is maybe a different order question. But it just seemed to me like a brute fact. Historically, there are lots of different groups clamoring for kind of the mantle of Christianity in that time period. Docetists and all the variations of the Gnostics. And there's a theological question of what do you make of the fact that the what they call the proto-Orthodox or proto-Catholic group, clearly wins out. But the fact is they did, right? That is a historical fact. That is the thing that came out of this group of people who are, talking about what they learned from the apostles. And I started to become very nervous of like, there might be something to this Catholic thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, continue the story. Like, where did you? What was the sort of major revelation that happened? If there was one, I mean, maybe there wasn't.
There wasn't. So
it was just a bunch of little things here and there that just led up to the point where you were just like, you know what? I just have to do this.
Yeah, I just did a lot of reading. It was over the course. It was well over a year, I think. Of like, I would come home. You can ask my wife about it. Like, I work a very busy job. I work in a very large law firm, and it's a very demanding profession. And I would get home late, and I would like just stay up late by myself, reading, just devouring everything I could get my hands on. And there was just something about this. I was very entranced with the intellectual tradition of the church, of Catholicism. It comes out in the early Christian writers. I remember reading Augustine and being like, this is a bit of the kind of one of the great fallacies of modernity. We think everybody was stupid back then because they, lacked a lot of scientific bases to understand the natural world or things. And I would read this and I was like, wow, like this makes sense. Like reading Augustine, I was like, this guy's incredibly intelligent and making these very nuanced arguments. I read Newman's, I turned at some point and I read the rest of Newman's essay on development. And that also struck me because at some level, I think what Newman is saying is like, look, we kind of the point we alluded to earlier. We don't have all the records of early Christianity. I mean, there are references in the Church Fathers to books that we don't have. Justin Martyr wrote like non-apologetic treatises about Christianity that are referred to, that everybody knew what they said, but like we don't have them anymore. They're gone. And what Newman's sort of I was just struck by the intellectual rigor and maturity of Newman's analysis of this theory of development, this concept of the unpacking of a true idea over time, the way that an acorn grows into a tree, and that there's something natural and good and true about this process of development when we're talking about true development. And I started listening to Bishop Robert Barron's series that he kind of launched his career with when he was Father Robert Barron, the Catholicism series. And get introduced to this other fellow whose books I got here, Thomas Aquinas, and I start reading through, coming from a tradition where the intellectual side, the side of our reason, I think fair to say in theological matters is downplayed, and a higher priority was put on sort of subjective experiential components.
What we might call
Uh, you
testimony.
know, yeah, I was, as you might, maybe to a fault, because I don't want to displace the importance of the subjective. It's not that doesn't matter, but maybe to some fault, as a reaction to that, I became very interested in the intellectual tradition of the church, and I, I grew up and just kind of had prejudices about Catholicism as this very superstitious and backward and like obviously not true thing. um, and then I start
you
reading.
do recount that in the earlier book, earlier parts of the book where you were a missionary, and how you visited a Catholic church one time, and you were like, "This is so gaudy."
Yeah, and I just kind of looked at Catholics as good people, but kind of benighted, and then I start to like engage with the great minds of the Catholic tradition, and it just transformed my life. I was, the kind of beautiful marriage of reason given to all mankind, even the pagans, right? That they have access to reason and the natural law, and how you can, this is one of the, I think I was mentioned before we came on air. I read William Lane Craig, a lot of Dr. Craig's work, because I was just working through this idea of like, oh, like I can believe in God and the claims of the Catholic Church, in large measure because they are reasonable and compelling. And I find the claims of Catholicism to be compelling. The claim that there is a God, I find compelling.
Did your experience as a lawyer come into play at all during all of this?
Maybe. I mean, look, to be fair to law is a tricky, area, because law partakes of, logical reasoning, and you need to be good at making arguments and the like. But law also, I think most students of history can identify some of the relationship between sophistry and law. That law is within an ethical set of bounds, of course. It is to win for your client, is to advocate for your client and to prevail. It is to persuade. And, logic isn't always the thing that persuades in the world, in courts and those sorts of things. It's certainly my time in law school and the way I started thinking about things, that was definitely an influence, because in legal training, you're taught to be very critical and to read very critically. And in law school, you famously go through what they call is the Socratic method, where you'll have courses where the professor doesn't ever tell you anything. They cold call some student and say, stand up and tell me the facts of this case. And they say, what's the rule of law they applied? Why did they apply it? And then it's a series of Socratic dialoguing back and forth, in which the professor is never giving you answers. He's just asking, or she's asking you more complicated questions, to point out flaws in your reasoning, or to show that how you've maybe articulated a rule is overly broad. And like, what about this situation? Would you change your mind? What does that tell you about what the rule really may be? And through this this kind of inductive process, you begin to be able to, what they call think like a lawyer, which is to read, case law and synthesize it and make arguments about what the law is, because sometimes it can be not clear. And I think that certainly had an influence on me. But I think kind of one of the big issues was just like, in Mormonism, we're taught that we're made in the image of God in a literal sense, that God has, fingers and toes and hair. And in that sense, we're made in the image of God. And being introduced to the Catholic teaching that we are made in the image of God because he has given us the gift of reason, of our will and our intellect, was just a complete paradigm shift, because it made me appreciate the gift of reason, that's what it is. Like, this is the thing that makes us made in God's image. And so it really elevated this gift that God has given to us for me, and made me realize that in revealing himself to the world, God has certainly done some things in Revelation. Like, I like the term from Bishop Barron, that there is the supra rational, right? That there are things through which unaided reason, we could not come to a knowledge of the inner life of the Trinity through unaided reason. But I just remember being like, wow, it's a de fide dogma of the Catholic Church that through unaided natural reason, we can know that God is real, that he exists. And I find those arguments to be compelling. And there was just something very elevating about that. And I think maybe to shift over to the kind of other side of the coin, at some point, like, I finally was like, well, maybe I should go to a Catholic church. I've never been to a mass before. I went to the parish that we have been members of now for several years. The first mass I ever went to was a traditional Latin mass. And I just, I didn't really have a sense of all the kind of debates in the church about the liturgy or anything. I was just like, oh, like, there's the Latin one is kind of the Catholicism of my imagination, the smells and bells kind of thing. And so I'll go see what that's like. And I was just deeply moved by the beauty of the mass, and this sense of like, there's something going on up there. And whether I'm kind of paying attention to it or not, like, there is something real going on up there. And to the credit of my fellow parishioners, as I look around at these Catholics in worship, I'm like, these people believe there's something really going on up there at that altar. And I approached the priest afterward and started down that journey. I didn't do RCIA. The priest and I sat down and we had an hour-long conversation, and he said, why don't we just meet in private? And we can just work through things in private. I don't think you need to go to RCIA. By that point, I had read almost all of the large catechism, like the big one. And so, I started on this process, and it was obviously difficult. It was a challenge. My wife was still very much Mormon, and my kids were very much Mormon. All of my family is very much Mormon. I had, told my family I was no longer believed in the Mormon church.
How did that go over?
As you would expect, not good. I mean, I would say all of us probably said things that we regretted. We have mended those things. I think I have a great relationship with my family, and we all love each other very much, but it's painful, and I wouldn't expect it to be any other way. And that gets back to the very first thing I said. My parents have deep conviction and taught me that religion is a real thing and it's serious, and that, and that, that's part of why I left Mormonism, was because I conclude I can't in good faith say that I believe this. I think this is not true. And on the Catholic side, I began going to mass every week, and just sitting there quietly watching. I bought a missal and start kind of learning the mass. And, after some time, it was, I think in July of 2018, I was on vacation with my family in Las Vegas, and I had gone back to the hotel to just kind of rest. And I was just kind of sitting there and thought, like, well, I should be baptized. I should become a Catholic. Like, that just, there's no lightning bolt or any kind of, big emotional boom or anything about it. It just seemed like this is the right thing to do. This, in fact, seems correct and true to me. And so I'm going to do it. And so I was baptized on November 4th, 2018. And it's been great ever since.
Yeah. What about, if you don't mind going into it, what was it like telling your parents? I mean, your parents raised you Mormon,
Yeah.
they're still in the faith. What was that experience like?
Yeah, it was painful. And, I don't know what the right way to handle it really was. Ultimately, I kind of shut out. My family did not shut me out. I shut them out. This is a mea culpa. I shut them out to some degree, in that I made it very clear I don't want to talk about why I'm leaving Mormonism with you. I don't want to, because there is a tendency
Do
within
you
Mormonism. Yeah.
do you think that it had anything to do with your earlier years and how you kind of like during your teenage years you left, and you kind of came back? Did any of that play into, were they like, oh no, he's doing it again?
No, I don't think so. I think it was more like, when this happens, kind of the standard response for some time. I think it's starting to change a little bit in LDS culture, but the standard response when someone maybe goes to their bishop and is like, I'm having doubts, is, well, remember your testimony, and focus on that, focus on your testimony, and is often to like not investigate and think about your doubts. Contrast that with, like, Aquinas, who says we actually have a moral obligation to like to resolve our doubts.
Mm.
Uh, and so I knew that those conversations could be very heated, and leaving Mormonism was the single most painful experience emotionally that I've ever gone through. That was incredibly difficult. I haven't really communicated that here. I think it comes out more in the book. It is very painful to have your entire worldview feel like it has been ripped away from you almost instantly. It's very difficult. And I just, I knew that if I sat down and family wanted to like talk about, some issue about Joseph Smith, that I probably would just fly off the handle and start, throwing facts, facts and logic at them. And all that was going to do is make stuff worse. It was going to make me feel bitter and angry, and make them feel rejected. So I don't know if it was the right decision, but I just said, I'm not ready to talk about the reasons that I'm leaving, that I'm done with Mormonism. Because that happened before I started investigating Catholicism. Like, when I came to the conclusion, like, Mormonism's not true, I was like, I just need to let people in my life know that this is not something I believe anymore.
Have you had any conversations with them about your reasons for leaving, or for joining the Catholic Church? Have you has that been a conversation? I mean, I kind of understand it, because I mean, I've had my own set of experiences as well. But like, for example, my brother, when he became an atheist, for the first couple of years, I was like, oh, we're going to talk about this all the time, and after a while, I was like, this is not productive. Like, there's not really a big reason for us to do this. So I wonder if there's a similarity there. If at one point you were just like
I love my family dearly, and have have really, with maybe some exception of like my wild teenage years, like, I've always had a great relationship with my parents and my siblings. And it causes division, and it's a real thing. And it seemed to me that the prudent way was to kind of let things simmer, and at some point I let people know, like, hey, I'm open to talking about it if you ever want to. And some of them have taken me up on that, and some of them haven't. And that's totally fine if they don't want to talk about it. And I know a number of them have read my book. And that's also maybe like a gentle way that they can kind of get some insight into my
Mm.
inner workings of how that process played out and how I felt about it in a way that I don't like love. Super happy to be here, but as you can tell, like I don't love to retread painful experience, right? Like nobody wants to be like, hey, let's talk about that really awful time in your life again. And but my family have been very great. My parents have come to the baptism of some of my children. They have been, good. The idea of like shunning people, that is not a Mormon thing. To the great credit of Mormon culture, the principle of how important family is is very strong, and like it's not like shun people. It's a sensitive topic, and it's more sensitive for some than for others, and kind of, so we haven't talked about it. It was obviously very challenging in my marriage, because my wife is
I was
very,
I was
very
kind
Mormon.
of
No,
not wanting to
we
go there if
won't
you
go
didn't
like
want to.
we won't go like too far into it, but I got really great counsel from my parish priest, and he was just like, "Look, this is a challenging situation." He I thought he was a lunatic. He was like, "I promise you, your wife is going to become Catholic. I guarantee it." And I was always just like, "Dude, you're a great, wise, smart, and holy man, but that is never happening." I had zero expectation that my wife would ever become Catholic. But he said, "Look, live the sacramental life. Go to mass, go to confession, be a good Catholic. Do not be pushy with your wife. That's not going to be a good idea." And let God work stuff out in his time. And when you see there are appropriate moments to talk about stuff, but be prudent about how you do it. And, I think that's not universal advice for everybody. But that happened to be very good advice for my personal situation and my family situation. And that of just trying to be a good Catholic. I think a lot of people, right? A lot of people who convert to Catholicism are in the situation of not everybody who I love dearly and want more, I would love for all of my family and my loved ones to be in communion with the Catholic Church and to receive our Lord. I greatly fail to appreciate how much the sacramental life really would change me as a person. And my wife, like when I ask her about her perspective of things, I didn't notice it a whole lot, but my wife saw a lot of really positive change in me as a husband, as a father, after I became Catholic. And, that her story is a separate story, but, that played some role in her ultimate decision to decide to look into these things and ultimately become Catholic. But it's tricky to navigate those family situations. And my younger brother, he has not been, he's not like a believing Mormon. He's not in the church really. He married a wonderful Catholic woman, and they are baptizing their daughter here soon. And I'm very fortunate enough to be godfather to my niece, and a lot of my family are coming. And so, I think one of the ways that you evangelize is just by trying to be a good Catholic. And when God's grace touches people and they have an interest, those can be good times to talk with people. That's not to say we shouldn't be out evangelizing generally. We should be, but in delicate family situations, they are delicate, and there are important relationships that we're trying to preserve there.
So we've been going, man, almost 2 hours. So we'll go ahead and wrap things up. We should have talked beforehand. How I didn't even know how much time you had for this tonight.
It's good. It's late here on the East Coast, so
it is. Okay, so maybe the last question I've got for you is, what advice would you have for a Mormon or LDS who is tuning in? They're starting to have doubts. What advice would you have for them?
Yeah. I think, so let me caveat one thing too, that I've said Mormon, you've said Mormon. In recent years, they've sort of taken a new umbrage at this thing. I think, to all my LDS friends, I mean no offense by using the shorthand term, and I hope they can appreciate that it is linguistically challenging to use the complete name of the church or some of the shorthands. So I don't mean anything disrespectful by calling people Mormon. I think to such a person, this is my sort of pitch is like, what really ought to matter to all of us is what's true. We should really want to know if something is true or if it's not true. And one of the things, that one of those questions that was a clear moment for me of like a decision point was having a sincere internal conversation that was like, if this thing isn't true, wouldn't you want to know that? And I think that just being open to saying, I want to be loyal and faithful to the truth, because ultimately to be faithful to the truth is to be faithful to God. God is truth. He is the source of all truth. And that should be, the guiding principle. And that requires openness on our part. And it can be challenging. It can be difficult, right? But, I never in a million years would have thought that one day I would become Catholic, and that I would do it, kind of up in my personal life to do so. I never thought that. And certainly thinking about those consequences is natural, but the real primary thing on which you ought to worry if you are entertaining doubts is the truth. And you should want to explore and understand the truth.
Jeremy, it's been fantastic. I wish we could spend another 4 or 5 hours just talking more about stuff. I mean, the truth is I've only got through, let me see, I think it's 51% of your book, but I was just reading it, as you said, 55%. Okay. Yeah. It's so good. So let me remind the audience, if you guys are still watching by this point, go pick up the book. Go read it. It's so good. I've got it linked in the description for your convenience. So good. But Jeremy, it's been great to have you on.
Thank you so much, Cameron. It's been great. Thank you for having me.
All right. Thank you guys for tuning in. We'll see you in the next Capturing Christianity video.